direct democracy and deliberative democracy make each other better? How do the two become chocolate and peanut butter, rice and beans, Lennon and McCartney? What does it take? We don't have a lot of time, so we get specific. I want to start to my right. This is a panel presented by the Berggruen Institute. Thank you very much for making this possible. Nathan, you and your colleagues. Nathan Gardells is the editor-in-chief of Noema magazine, which you should be reading. He's co-founder and a senior advisor to the Berggruen Institute. He's been editor of New Perspectives Quarterly, and he is author of many things, including co-author with Nicholas Berggruen of Renovating Democracy, Governing in the Age of Globalization and Digital Capitalism. Nathan, so my question to you, if you've got it, is essentially, is how do you get this impact? I mean, how do you get this impact? If you were designing, a citizens' assembly for our home state of California, or if you were coming back to the Chileans, picking up the pieces and saying, we're going to do this again, but not with an elected constitutional convention, but a lottery created one that's representative of the Chilean population. What would you do, and what specifically would be that connecting fiber to get you from the citizens' assembly to a real impact?
Yeah, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just preface it with just a couple conceptual comments to frame that question of yours. So there are two conditions that frame the challenges to democracy today, two basic conditions. Some have been mentioned in the earlier panel. Across all democracies, there is a breach of distrust between the public and the institutions of self-government and demand for more inclusiveness, number one. Secondly, since social networks have drawn more players into the political fray than ever before, never has the need been greater for a counterbalance of impartial practices and institutions that sort out the cacophony of voices, the welter of conflicting interests, the deluge of contested information. So the way to respond to these challenges, the way to mend this breach of distrust and deliver inclusiveness is through an idea we call participation without populism, which means integrating the broader civil society into governance through new mediating institutions that complement representative government and enhance deliberation in direct democracy. Some of this, you mentioned citizen assemblies, and I'll get to how we get there. Citizen assemblies that have taken place in France or Ireland, some of the people behind us were engaged in those in Australia as well, are examples of this, just as the citizen panels on the Conference on the Future of Europe that were mentioned are this kind of a mediating institution. The problem generally is that where there are these kind of deliberative practices, they are not binding but advisory. The problem with direct democracy, it's binding, but it lacks any institutional deliberation. That's the core problem. So when you go back to Chile, for example, or you talk about California, California is a good example. We have direct democracy, and people talked about corporations, but there's no check on a proposition or a ballot. There's no discussion or deliberation of it among the public. So, for example, 2 years ago, the legislature passed a law making contractors into employees for ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft didn't like it, so they went to the ballot with a referendum, spent $224 million to overturn the legislation, and their stock price was up $13 billion the next day. The citizens had no voice at all in this process. So a problem with direct democracy without deliberation is it's hijacked by organized special interests. And in order to avoid that, you need the kind of citizen review panels you have in Oregon, or you need citizens' assemblies themselves that propose propositions or initiatives. Because in a state, here in Switzerland, you have 100,000 signatures to get on a ballot. In California, we have 40 million people, and you need at least 1 million signatures to do anything. It costs a huge amount of money. Ordinary citizens are not allowed to do that. They don't have the capacity to do it. So these kind of citizen assemblies linked to direct democracy and deliberation, I think, is the way to go.
Okay. Thanks very much. And there's a request from a couple audience members to hold the conversations and back down. There is sound travels well in this building, so it's sometimes hard for folks here to hear if you're talking, but it's great to be talking. That's what we're here for. I want to switch, go ahead north to Oregon, to Wendy Willis, who is your partner in the future, what was it, the Republic, the Pacific States of America with us in California, but you're a writer, lawyer, an advocate for democracy, founder and director of Oregon's Kitchen Table, which is at Portland State, executive director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium. You've done a lot of other things, but you're also an author, textbooks, book essays, 2 books of poems, terrific recent book. These are strange times, my dear. That's a title that lands. So you've talked about, when we talked last, you mentioned, that the trouble with pluralistic democracies, in the world is that they can be quite incoherent and unresponsive. And I mean, incoherent even in Oregon, where they've used direct democracy to legalize the drug laws. So you're supposed to all be more coherent now, right? So how do you deal with that? How do you reckon with that? How do you combine these types of democracy in ways that deal with that incoherence problem?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Can you hear me? So, I mean, I think some of Oregon's incoherence is because of direct democracy, right? So, I took a picture of the table of contents for the Oregon Constitution this morning.
Okay.
And of course, there's, a Bill of Rights and all of that, but there's also water development projects, multifamily housing for elderly and the disabled, seismic rehabilitation of public education buildings, pension liabilities, school capital costs, state printing. So that's what the Oregon Constitution looks like because of direct democracy. So any random thing can be proposed. 8%, you can get 8% of the people. 8% of the people who voted in the last election, governor's election, sign a petition, and then whatever can come onto the ballot. So I mean, I think we're on a spectrum, right? So the spectrum, on one end of the spectrum is kind of ossified institutions that can't move, but are relatively coherent because there's been a deliberative process that developed them. And on the other hand, a sort of chaotic incoherence. And so I think what we're trying to do is try to create some structures in the middle to try to loosen up that spectrum.
You have a new project, are you at liberty to talk about it, that suggests, since I'm far away, I think I'm out of the jurisdiction of the American authorities, that suggests that the American Constitution needs a replacement, essentially. I mean, how would that work how would you imagine that working with the deliberative process? I mean, who would even run an American system? Would we have to ask our friends at INE in Mexico to come in and run it for us? They would have more experience than anyone in our country. So how would that work?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in foundational documents in general. So yes, the U.S. Constitution I'm super interested in.
Yeah.
I'm also really interested in city charters, state constitutions, and so because I think there's 2 reasons to do it, right? One is the structural reasons we're talking about here, that there are structural barriers to a democratic society. But there are also creedal reasons to do it. It's one of the few places we make a statement about our commitments to democracy. And I think, as Simone mentioned earlier, there's just a lot of kind of background static about what we don't like. But I think it's really important for us to generate what we do like as a creed, and that sort of creedal energy then can kind of launch a bunch of innovation around democratic practices. So, I mean, I think the U.S. Constitution is one thing, and there's never been an Article 5 convention, which is what a constitutional convention would look like. There's a lot of opposition to it for all kinds of reasons, but there's a lot of practice that we could undertake about creedal documents before we got to the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you. I want to bring in Calypso Nicolaitis. Her resume and all the different things she's up to, it was just exhausting to look at it. But she, among other things, is chair in global affairs at the School of Transnational Governance, where she convenes that's the EUI Democracy Forum. She's on leave from Oxford, was at Harvard, and other places. She's worked with a number of EU institutions, including as a member of the European Council's Reflection Group on the Future of Europe. She is co-convener, chair a number of initiatives, including the EUI-wide Cluster on Democracy in the 21st Century, with the European University. Anyway, Calypso, I want to, actually I recommend her book also, A Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law, Why We Need to Fight for the Most Precious Human Interventions of All Time. Calypso, you're working and thinking a lot at the transnational level, obviously, and I wonder, we were seeing transnational deliberative bodies. What do we know? What's the best thinking about how to make sure these transnational bodies have a real impact legally, constitutionally, when there isn't a lot of transnational government to sort of implement things?
Hello, Joe, and hello, everyone or next to the pool. I wish I was with you in the Global Forum but in any case, this is a fundamental discussion. And Joe, you're asking, what do we know? Well, we don't know. We know huge amounts, as this panel and so many experts and my colleagues on the call, will reflect, because there's been maybe, almost 1,000 in the last 15, 20 years of deliberative democracy exercise around the world. What there hasn't been is doing it across countries, transnationally. There was a question in the previous panel about global democracy. Well, there is a beginning of a trial in the context of the COP26. There was one just a few months ago, but it was very tentative and difficult. Now in the EU, we've had for a year, in the last year, 4 transnational democracy panels with 200 citizens chosen across countries and all of that, but with lots of difficulties and flaws and complications that we are still trying to know, to analyze. How did it work? So there's many lessons to draw from it. But I think that let me just put a few on the table. First of all, that and I want to draw, when we drove from Nathan's and Wendy's, already our brilliantly outlined vision, and we say, how could these local assemblies, or even national, like in Ireland or in France, be applied to the transnational level? Many people say, well, no, the problem of scale, how a few hundred people can aim to represent randomly, the bigger group. The problem of scale is so hard to overcome. No, we can't do it. Well, I think there is a scale paradox that actually, if you do it, the transnational level needs deliberation even more, because people see their representative further and further around tables in the UN General Assembly now, and they're even further than a national representative or whatever. So in a way, people need to feel that they can connect and access each other directly, even if it's through watching a deliberation. And that's when our topic of the direct deliberation comes in, or direct democracy comes in. Joe, you said Lenin and McCartney. Yeah, I wish there was as much harmony between those two sides of the coin as Lenin and McCartney. I think it's more like chocolate and peanut butter. Many people like one, but not the other, except in the US. So what is happening in Europe is the first thing we need to talk about is to overcome, I think in most quarters of traditional representation in the EU, the idea that, direct democracy is not for us in the EU. Every time we have referenda, they create havoc in the EU. So actually, the way deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies are seen by the powers to be is an alternative to direct democracy. It's to avoid and to being able to say, hey, we've done it, check the box. We don't need direct democracy. So what we want to advocate here in the Global Forum with you and with this panel is no, it's not an alternative. Actually, it will do a lot of things for us. Nathan said it already. It's about taming the capture of our democratic process by corporation, and especially when they get to capture the direct democracy. or by populist demagogues. So it can do a lot of work for us by taking in direct democracy, but making it, taming it, empowering it. But I tell you, this is a long road in the EU, a very long road. And I think Switzerland can be very inspiring in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You're getting a lot of applause here. I'm not sure you can hear it. I want to go back to you, but I first actually wanted to turn to my ancestral homeland and David Farrell, who's a specialist in the study of representative elections, parties, and deliberative mini-publics. His most recent books include the Oxford Handbook of Irish Politics, which I highly recommend, and deliberative mini-publics. David, I was just in Dublin last weekend, and I've read all the great stuff about Irish citizens' assemblies, and my first question was to a long-serving 30-year member of the Dublin City Council, Dermot Lacey, about this Dublin Citizens Assembly, and it's convened to look at an elected mayor for Dublin and surrounding counties, and he immediately cynically said, "Oh, we just did that to kill that idea." And I thought that's pretty cynical, but then I read David Farrell in February in the Irish Times when he wrote, "It's no wonder that Ireland is seen as a leading light in the world of citizens' assemblies. They have made important contributions on issues like abortion and marriage, but these high-profile successes disguise the fact that many, many other recommendations from previous assemblies have been ignored, rejected, or left to gather dust. That's a lot of time and effort and public funding wasted for rather little return. Much praise has been heaped on Ireland as a trailblazer in this space, but is this praise still deserved?" I pose your own question to you. What did you guys do right in those two that we hear about that you haven't done in all these other settings?
I think a lot of it is just dependent on the issue. So abortion and marriage equality were really hot topics, and in my country, very difficult topics to deal with. And there's absolutely no doubt that the Citizens' Assembly played a crucial role in helping get those over the wire in terms of the debate in Parliament and then subsequently the debate nationally through our referendum. But once you go away from those big hot topic issues, there's a whole list. It's an exhausting and rather depressing list of recommendations going back now over a decade from Irish citizens' assemblies that have been ignored, rejected, and rejected summarily, so not even discussed, or put on a long finger in the long grass, whatever, pick your metaphor, but nothing is going to happen with them. So whenever I'm asked, what should we do if we're going to go down the road of citizens' assemblies, I just say go to Belgium, because Belgium is where you're seeing some of the best innovations in the practical use of citizens' assembly type activities, or deliberative mini-publics, as we refer to them. There's a lot of really interesting innovations being trialed in Belgium, in other places, but Belgium seems to be where a lot of this is going on. So Ireland blazed its trail, going back about 10 years. We showed the world, at least, that citizens' assemblies have something to contribute, can really help. But I think the problem is we've got a bit stuck in a rut now. It's been largely taken over by the politicians and by government, the model of the citizens' assembly as is applied in my country, and it's not been applied as well as it could be.
So what can you be a little specific about Belgium, what you see in Belgium that leads to impact? I mean, I'll go. I don't think the coffee's very good, so sell me on why I should go and see it.
I'll just give you two quick examples. There's one that's called the Ost-Belgian model, which a couple of us were involved in helping to design. And this is used by the German-speaking communities parliament. Belgium has a lot of parliaments, so there's a parliament for German speakers in the east of the country. And what that is it's a permanent citizens' assembly. And its job is to put ideas on the agenda that require a specific citizens' assembly to discuss. And then when that citizens' assembly has come up with its views, they're fed into the parliament, and the parliament is obliged to engage in a dialogue with the citizens' assembly. They can reject the proposals, but they must engage with them respectfully. So at least they're not ignored or put in the long grass. That's one model. And then the second model, briefly, is the one that the Brussels Parliament has adopted, which is where you the citizens can petition for saying that something needs to be something that's going to be discussed in the Parliament should be discussed in a deliberative process. So the parliamentary committee, whose remit that issue falls under, establishes a special kind of committee, a super committee, which includes a random selection of citizens from the city of Brussels. And they then discuss these issues and come forward with proposals that, again, the Parliament is obliged to engage with respectfully. And these are two, and we're seeing versions of this in Paris. It looks like Scotland might be moving in a similar direction. And indeed, the Conference on the Future of Europe, as Calypso knows better than me, is also sort of suggesting ideas that might be along these sort of lines down the road. These are the sort of ways, by innovating the model and embedding it much more into our representative system. Here, I agree with the previous speakers. I'm not much of a fan of direct democracy myself. I think that the better way of linking deliberative democracy is with the representative system of democracy.
Thank you. Let me turn to Dean Walker. Thank you so much for being here, because since I screwed up, he's the executive director of the New Democracy Foundation in Australia. He's been doing that since 2011. He's led over 20 trial projects at local government and state government level, including projects for state premiers on both sides of politics. It's ranged from long-term budgeting for the city of Melbourne financial plan to the potential for a high-level nuclear waste storage facility in South Australia. You work on the state and local level, and I'm curious, when you think about the local level and what you've seen and participated in, what are the best ways to make sure that these deliberative processes have real impact, and what are the pitfalls that people fall into?
I think it picks up off what David was saying, especially where the political sponsor starts with, I have a problem.
Yeah.
By definition, they're looking for, get me out of jail, help me out. And they're more likely to then adopt the recommendations, because if they could have taken another path, they would have done it. So at local government level, commonly we start the conversation with, tell me what's hard. Budget balancing, urban planning. These are things where you get criticised for all possible decisions. So you start with that desire to embrace it. And I think where people start from I just want to try something and be feel good and inclusive, it's a noble starting point, but that is a path to having a project that doesn't really go anywhere. And I think an example was used earlier by Nathan on Uber. There probably wasn't a great political appetite to fix in one direction or another. So it was, direct democracy would be good. A deliberative process probably wouldn't have worked. But where you're seeking a politician and saying, I am stuck, we found a very high traction in terms of decisions being adopted. So across about 30 projects we've looked, and it's about 90% adoption rate, amusingly, occasionally after several years. So some of them can be slow, but the problem remains.
Is there an example of where it's worked particularly well? Is there a model from Australia that you point to where, gosh, we really got the job done there?
Look, the best examples, I think, City of Melbourne's been a great project. It's getting a little long in the teeth now. Hasn't been great to have 2 years sitting on the sidelines because of COVID. But literally the city came to us and said, we're not broke, but if we continue on our path, we've got a $1.2 billion deficit coming up. We're a $400 million a year council. And we simply posed a question, how do we live within our means? And I think where's the markers, you talk about a model, I think you aim people at the hardest part of the problem. Things that are too broad become shallow, become a little bit wish listy rather than trade-offs. These have value as a complement to the political system where it solves a problem for the politician. And I think I've seen myriad European climate assemblies, and I don't blame the politicians for not adopting them. I blame people like us for not better designing the project. Oh, wow. Having a local government project looking at climate change and then commenting on tax rates they don't control and transport systems they don't operate, you'd start from, what does my jurisdiction control? In climate, it's probably siting of anything renewable and what you build things out of. Why ask a what to do about climate change question? Why not point to that very hard part of the problem? So be specific and then give adequate time. And I see so many projects that are insufficient time with a massive project, and it can't work from the outset.
Okay, that's actually a very good prompt for me to bring in Andre. In baseball, the most democratic sport, the home team bats last, and so here you are, up last, but with the last ups. So you're from Switzerland. You're the Centrum für Demokratie Aarau, and you've conducted 6 citizens' councils in Switzerland, including 2 in the form of the Citizen Initiative Review, which we often associate with Oregon, and 4 times in the form of climate councils at the, what Ian was just referencing at the city or cantonal level. And we hear a lot of good things about Switzerland, right? And it's direct and representative democracies are sometimes offered as models. So how does deliberative democracy fit in when it's going so well, or isn't it going so well?
Thank you. First, thank you very much for the invitation and being here and for this question and this interesting panel. Of course, it's always the first question one gets asked here in Switzerland, do you really need also these deliberative processes because you have already the best democracy in the world, you have direct democracy, what else do you want and need? I think some points have already been tipped on that I think we need to think about what actually is the task of a direct democracy and what brings in a direct democracy or instruments of direct democracy and what is the complement a deliberative process can bring in. And Nathan, you said it well at the beginning, they have different tasks and different opportunities. And in fact, it's true, we have a lot of participation here in Switzerland. Only this Sunday we vote on 3 national issues, but at the end it's a yes and no vote at the end of a political process, and the people can say yes or no. So, and in fact, in the implementation or in the development of policy measures and options, there is a big opportunity also here in Switzerland to integrate deliberative processes to co-create solutions where there is not an easy yes or no answer. So I think there is also opportunities in the policy process to bring in deliberative processes. At the same time, in a direct democracy, we demand a lot from our citizens. We vote every 4 months here in Switzerland, every 3 months, on complex issues, on different issues, and it's really hard to build up one's opinion about all these issues. So we demand a lot from our citizens, and also here I think the processes like the Citizen Initiative Review, where we have greatly been inspired by the Oregon model, is really a good fit here to promote public opinion formation in the Swiss process, to actually help citizens to understand better what they are actually voting about and supporting them for building their opinions. And what is interesting about this is that the effects from Oregon, from the Citizen Initiative Review, so people who read the statements coming out of a CIR, we see there is a knowledge increase, there is a high trust in the deliberative process, and it's also nice to see that these effects travel to Finland and also here in Switzerland with our experiences.
Is there possible to briefly describe how the CIR worked in the Swiss context? One of the 2 you did. Where was it? What was the issue? What was the impact?
So we had 2 experiences with the CIR. One was in Sio in 2019. It was a national vote for affordable housing. We conducted it in the city of Sio. And the other one was on a cantonal level in the canton of Geneva with a cantonal initiative, actually to abolish the pension of former conseillers d'État, former chiefs of or executive members of the executive. And it was we randomly selected 22 citizens. They deliberated for 2 weekends on the issue. They questioned the pro and the contra camp of the initiative. They questioned experts, and they deliberatively formulated the citizen statements. 8 key facts, what you really need to know about the initiative, what are the main arguments against the initiatives, and what are the main arguments for voting for the initiative. And this has been sent out to all the voting households in the respective canton or city.
Okay, interesting. And did the citizens, did the vote go the same way that the Citizens Initiative Review voted in these cases?
In one example, yes. So in Sio, it was quite interesting. We didn't publish it, but we did an anonymous vote within the panel, and we see the distribution of yes and no was quite exactly the same as afterwards it has been in the wider population. So that was quite remarkable. In the canton of Geneva, it was different. So there the task was a bit difficult as well because there was a counter proposal as well. So there was an initiative, a counter proposal worked out by the legislative, and the citizen panel, there was a vast majority voting for the counter proposal, but in the end the popular initiative has been adopted.
Okay. I want to go back to Calypso, and I want to ask for some free consultation on behalf of North America. Just to maybe a little design, and you have this whole team assembled you can draw from Calypso in doing this. But I'm going to say, let's imagine it's the year 2027, and the 2026 World Cup in soccer was a roaring success, jointly hosted by Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It changed the dynamic in North America. It reduced crazy American fears about the border. It brought these three great nations together. And so President Chicharito in Mexico, President Megan Rapinoe in the US, and President Wayne Gretzky in Canada jointly have decided to convene. They want a North American union. Because why should the Europeans have all the fun and bureaucratic frustrations? And so they get this union together, and they need a constitution to start it. And you know, this deliberative wave still hasn't crested. So here we go. We need a deliberative body and to enact it. That's transnational. How would you design that process?
Hey, Joe, how long do we have?
We have another half an hour, and we can cut into the coffee break a little, too.
And can we ask, I mean, my biggest frustration on this wonderful conversation is I can't see the crowd, but I can kind of feel the room. And I know they're coming from all over the world. So it's really their ideas that I would love to bring in. You know, one of my big beliefs is that when I say we, I mean the West, I mean the US and Europe. We need to reverse the democratic gaze and ask people from around the world, from your experience in democratic innovation, how do you judge us? What do you tell us? So now you're asking me as a European to give advice to three presidents whose name I've already forgotten, Joe.
It's true,
I
but
apologize for that.
We'd hire you. You're from Greece. You invented this democracy thing we're dealing with, right? So
Indeed,
what's the model? What's the ideal?
So indeed, so you know, you say Greece. So the first question is, will you make all these Mexicans, Canadians, and Americans feel that this constitution that will be written, I hope, by founding mothers and not just founding fathers and founding children, will represent them? So the first big requirement that we all discuss is inclusiveness. How do you create deliberative processes that are inclusive? And there are two ways, you know, one, and that need to be combined, is that, yes, these deliberations that are holistic across the three countries, where let's say you convene an assembly of 1,000 people, and you make it super visible and transparent and simple how they were selected randomly. There's a whole pedagogy of randomness. Randomness, a beautiful concept that is very democratic, but a lot of people think, well, you know, they're chosen by an algorithm. You know, why are they legitimate? And let's start with a pedagogy of randomness, if I can put it that way. Why it's beautiful. And the second thing would be to say inclusiveness. We won't do it like the U.S. founding fathers, you know, on the East Coast somewhere. Well, and not even on the West Coast somewhere. It has to be everywhere, polycentric. As Margaret Ostrom and so many others, polycentricity, many centers, many places. So, you know, I'm not 100% sure there would need to be a constitution anyway, Joe. But if I take your, you know, thought experiment, let's have 1,000 flower bloom. And let's have those, you know, randomly selected assemblies debate everywhere in this new union. And then each send ambassadors to not one center, but then create centers that will rotate all around. So one day it will be, you know, in Montreal. The next day it will be in Chicago. And the third day, it will be in Mexico. And so, and it will rotate, and in smaller cities and all of that. So you would create in that way, and using, of course, e-democracy and just plurification of debate. And of course, David has huge experience in how this worked quite well in the Irish context, where pulling the media in. But here we're talking transnational. So you're going to have to use also all the wonderful new translation technology. So I'm trying to paint a very rosy picture of that wonderful world that you're giving us, Joe. I love it. And if I had another half hour, I would, converse with everyone in the room as to what will be the obstacles. Let's think about everybody who would resist this in the 3 countries. And how do you either neutralize them? Let's not forget there is power in the world, or how you co-opt them. And let's think about this together, because that's what you're suggesting, Joe, a common process. And let's not forget that in this whole story, when we're talking about direct democracy and how to combine with deliberation, we need to bring politicians in and make them feel secure, which was one of the great challenges of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Fascinating learning process of politicians trying to get their heads around what's going on with these citizens ambassadors, trying to tell them what to think. And at the end of the day, Joe, you're going to now tell me, well, will this constitution be put to a vote? And well, that's what we're talking about in this panel, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, because we are going to try to create a mega Switzerland on the other side of the Atlantic, because we just heard beautifully that, in Switzerland, you have informed public opinion. Even without formal deliberative process, you have all these micro deliberation everywhere when you have direct democracy. So that's also the meta agenda that you're giving us, Joe, for this new union, this new NAFTA reincarnated union. It will be that this kind of culture takes root thanks to this constitutional moment. So it would be a constitutional moment of deliberation. And then I tell you, we would have a vote, and we wouldn't lose it like it has been lost in Chile, because as Nathan has beautifully written in Noema very recently, it would be an inclusive process. And that's the key to winning the vote at the end of the day.
That was great. Thank you. David, do you want to get in on this? Do you have any thoughts on this project?
Yeah, I always find Calypso's thought experiments fascinating. So I'm just sort of in awe always of everything that she has to say in these areas. But I mean, certainly I just mentioned one thing which I found one of the most incredible, I know this might sound a little bit strange, but one of the most incredible moments I've ever experienced, which was when the Conference on the Future of Europe, one of the panels came to Dublin. They came to Dublin Castle, and I was very lucky to be able to sit in on one of the small group deliberations. I was describing this to a colleague yesterday. It was like watching a dubbed movie. I was sitting in the room with these headphones on, and there were, I think it was 8 or 10 citizens, each from a different European country, each speaking a different European language, interpreters in Brussels, remotely interpreting in real time what these people were saying to each other. And after a few minutes, you forget, you're listening, I'm listening in English to all of these things. Now and again, it's a bit confusing when it's a male voice, but it's a woman who's speaking. But other than that, it's perfect. I mean, almost perfect deliberation. And so the Conference on the Future of Europe, for all its faults and failings, it's a really interesting experiment, shows that the kind of thing you're talking about, which would be involving at least 3 different language groupings, if not more, could work. And we know now that these things can work.
And David, if I can say, you remember one of the beauties of translations that we were discussing is that it slows down the conversation a bit. And in a way, that's even better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ian, do you have thoughts on this? Do you have
probably just 2 points I'd add in. I was flinching a little bit, Joe, at some of your language. It was almost, how do we sell people this decision? And appreciating it's a thought experiment, it's kind of the wrong place to start. There's no right answers to most public questions. We ask an open question, and if people really don't want to be part of a North American Union, that's an awesome answer too. The question is whether they've thought about it or whether it's just an opinion reaction. And I often think of, what's the key concept we're working here? We're just trying to find a trusted decision. And that starts from this people like me test. And a lot of the time, what's hard about transnational is that it's in any, pick your COP26, they operate at this elite level that is not related to people's daily lives. So we have these international decisions that get brought back to people, and domestic politicians can't implement them because there isn't a sense. I'd really encourage people to think of who is that people like me test. In the United States, you've probably got West Coast views, Midwest views, so on and so forth. There's half a dozen locations. Think first about how people identify with that people like me line first and build up from there. I always get a little bit worried by, as we go through airports, you probably hear the phrase, we have performative security. It's probably not going to work, but we feel better with all the scanners and wands, etc. There's a bit of theatre of security. And I often look at it through the lens of how much are we doing a theatre of democracy rather than a substantive attempt to say, right, what should we be focusing on? I think that maybe a future panel, the thought experiment to do might be, I think President Biden would love to reform gun laws in the United States.
Yeah.
That's a design worth doing that would come with endorsement, that would come from that ability to do a distributed project and think in terms of who are the people like me, those East Coast elites, those West Coast liberals, some of the funny places in the middle as well, and start to work out, right, how do we build it so that my local view is represented, but then I start to mix and start to go through there. The transnational one's super difficult because language, it can be a barrier to just that free-flowing conversation. I think what the EU attempted was heroically difficult.
Yeah, that's a great point. It also reminds me we would have to make sure that the deliberative spaces are exempt from the open carry laws in the U.S. And sorry about Cell. It's just 4 generations of family in Southern California. It's too close to Hollywood. The three of you, Wendy and then Nathan Andre, on this question of, which I'm really trying to get is, what is the model way to connect before we go to questions from the audience? The model way to connect to, how to do a big, gnarly national or transnational, deliberative democracy. How do you,
Well,
what do you think of?
I don't think
model?
it has to be. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, 40 million people. So you're almost at that kind of situation there. In terms of constitution, I think you got to be very careful. And we know if we just watch the Chilean situation, a constitution can't be a grab bag of everyone's social wishes or constituencies. A constitution is about basic rights and about the rules of political competition so that it can be peaceful and not violent. So there's checks and balances. Government, as I said about a Senate, bicameral legislature, a government is a positive, a constitution is a negative. A government is what acts, and a constitution is what amends or resists action. So you need those rules. The Constitution should focus on that. Now, in terms of how to come up with a deliberative process, we saw in the Chilean situation, because delegates were elected, there was a lot of politics in it, and the right wing wanted a two-thirds vote in order to put a constitution to the public.
That was within the convention, yeah.
Within their convention, but the right wing did not get 35 or 40% of the vote. They only got 20%. So it was a partisan Congress that was elected, assembly that was elected, and they were largely left behind constituencies who, not surprisingly, got a chance to get ahead and went too far by excluding some mainstream constituencies. So that ended up in frustration. I think when I heard Calypso, one way to deal with the constitution of an assembly, not a constitution, but how do you constitute an assembly, sortition instead of election is a better way to get a random sampling of the public that's not distorted like an echo chamber is with social media. Sortition is a better way to get a broad representation that is, random selection like in the old early Greek democracy. But I'm in favor also, and I discussed this with former President Lagos of Chile just last week, how to go forward. You need, since you have a representative democracy in place, you need the political parties or some representation of those political parties that represent the balance of power currently somehow in the mix. If they don't have a say, it's not going to work. Similarly, you need experts who know what they're talking about in constitutions, checks and balances, the history of constitutions, constitutional theory, and so on. So I think a mix of sortition, a mix of experts, and a mix of the political balance that exists currently. An example, and I'll stop here, an example in California, not in constitution, but in drawing legislative districts, so there's not gerrymandering. There's a citizens commission that draws electoral districts. We had a ballot initiative that took it away from the legislature, 8 years ago or 10 years ago. And you have, I forget the exact number of people, I think it's 13 or so. You have representatives of the two main political parties, and then you have randomly selected citizens. And the process together allows for a fair set of rules coming out of it that are legitimate because of the composition of how that commission is. So I think you have to limit what the Constitution does, and then you have to make sure that those who are, how the assembly itself is constituted to make it work.
Any design tips from you all? I mean, I do wonder sort of, you know, if deliberative, the sort of electoral representative, the deliberative body, the electoral representative bodies, the direct democracy, you know, if they check each other in a system, how do you make sure you're frustrated?
You're going to be frustrated. Like that's
well, get them to act. If the deliberative body is something that the legislative body has to say yes or no or offer a counter proposal, they both go to the direct democratic body. I'm designing on the fly here. Yeah. I mean, in my thing, I don't know how you would do it. The problem is the Americans just refuse to have national elections, but you know, like a modern country. But how? I mean, any design tips from what you've heard?
First of all, poets are massive scavengers, and so I have dibs on the title, "The Pedagogy of Randomness" for a poem title. I think there's so many great technical suggestions here, and I think one of the things about where we are right now is we have to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And if we're really like trying to swing for the fences and to do a massive constitutional deliberation, I'm really interested in the cultural aspects of that, like how do you build democratic culture as part of that? And what are the aesthetics of surrounding a citizen assembly, a vote? How do you, we recognize that, you know, people are living in a culture that looks nothing like our political culture every day, right? That involves music and food and joy and connection, and they're looking for belonging and purpose. And I think those elements have to be built in, and that thinking about those things, not just inside the assembly, but outside the room. Like how do you build a kind of joyful democratic culture that's swirling around the outside of this room so that the connection is really meeting human need as much as it's meeting like technical constitutive needs. And so I'm hoping that some of the next wave of work we can do together is to think about those things, because the bad guys, the anti-democratic people, the QAnons, the conspiracy theorists, they are thinking about belonging, connection, purpose, and I think it's about time that we start to think about those things in a positive, joyful, resilient, connective way.
Andre, you've done this work, any design tips for this concept?
Well, I mean, I can bring in a Swiss perspective. So I'm a direct Democrat by DNA. So and I'm thinking about how can we use deliberative processes to make direct democracy and the usage of our instruments here in Switzerland better. Let me give you two examples. We have the optional referendum. So when legislative process passes a law, you can announce a referendum. You collect 50,000 signatures within 100 days, and we can vote on the law. Now this happens regularly, and so this is, and then the work of the legislative process is challenged by the people. Then in a vote, if the law is rejected by the people and they say no, we are not happy with this law, the whole legislative process starts again from scratch. So I think I like to think about opportunities where to bring in deliberative processes in these direct democratic instruments. And I think this would be one opportunity to bring in a citizens' assembly when a law has been rejected by the public, to bring in actually the public into the policy creation process and design together a new solution which potentially can be adopted by the public. So to really also strengthen the connection between the politicians and ordinary citizens and get the help from ordinary citizens. How do we need to change the law that you will at the end accept it? Another example is with the usage of popular initiatives. You can have an idea, you collect 100,000 signatures, we will vote on it. Now, the thing with the popular initiatives, there are 9 out of 10 popular initiatives get rejected by the people. So there's a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort into making use of this instrument. Why not use a citizens' assembly at the very beginning of the formulation for a popular initiative? Hey, we have an idea, we want to bring in forward issue X, Y, Z. Let's think together, how do we need to create or formulate this initiative to increase the probability that it will be accepted? So these are kind of 2 examples, and I'm really looking forward to discuss these kinds of complements to really strengthen these 2 forms and make democracy better through the complementation of these 2.
Thank you. So give a big thanks for this incredible panel.